everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out. My name is Lexi Walls, and I'm a student with the University of Washington's Engage program. I'm also a biochemistry grad student, and the work that I do focuses on viruses and the ultimate goal of being able to design vaccines with our better understanding of viruses. As a graduate student, I get really specialized training in how to do a very specific type of research. The Engage program gave me another type of training that graduate students rarely get. I learned how to talk about my science in a way that is engaging, enlightening, and informative. You can learn more about our innovative program at engage-science.com. And now, to our second speaker. When you think about fisheries in our region, do you ever think about the importance of wind and phytoplankton? Our next speaker will shed light on the coastal upwelling cycle and how variability in wind patterns can affect the productivity of fisheries through its influence on the nutrient supply. Please give a warm welcome to Hally Stone.
I'm Hally Stone, and I am a PhD student in the School of Oceanography, and today I'll be telling you a tale of fish and phytoplankton. So how many of you enjoy eating our local seafood? Yeah, me too. And how many of you have dragged others or been dragged to Pike Place Market and saw the infamous flying fish? Yeah, I've been there a lot of times, and every time I'm amazed by how many local fisheries we have here in Washington. And so some of my favorites, and perhaps yours, are the delicious and succulent Dungeness crab, rich, delicious, creamy salmon, available in a variety of species that are all uniquely different. And I'll admit that I, as a transplant, can't really tell them all apart yet, but I'm working on it. The dangerously named, yet still delicious, razor clams. Beautiful and delicate rockfish. Oops. Okay, there we go. And perhaps my favorite local seafood, oysters. So briny and so buttery. And of course served on the half shell for the maximum oceanic flavor. And so now that I've made you all hungry, how would you feel if in the future seafood became prohibitively expensive? Perhaps like $500 per pound of salmon. Or if it just wasn't available anymore, and we're stuck eating goldfish. Well, in the face of climate change, that could happen. Fisheries are a huge part of both the economic and cultural identity here in Washington. In 2015, commercial and recreational fisheries accounted for 23,000 jobs and contributed $2.5 billion to the local economy. And these fisheries include salmon, crab, razor clams, shrimp, all those things I've talked about, and many more. But have you ever really stopped to think about where all these fisheries are coming from? Why are they here? And what were their lives like before they ended up on your plate? Maybe smothered in some sort of delicious sauce? Have you ever thought about what feeds all of these fisheries? So, to talk about that, let's begin with a look at a food web on land. So at the bottom of the food web are organisms like plants that get their energy from the sun to make their own food. And these kinds of organisms are called primary producers. And on land they include plants like grasses, trees, and kale. And next, we have organisms that eat those primary producers. And these organisms are called primary consumers. And on land, primary consumers include those small furry animals like squirrels and rabbits, bigger furry animals like moose, and in the human realm, vegans. Then you have organisms that eat primary consumers, or essentially animals that just eat other animals. On land, these animals would include carnivores like fox and wolves, and birds of prey like owls. And so, when you put all this together, you can see that many of these animals eat more than one thing, and it's actually quite complex and web-like, hence the name food web. And similar to your garden, there are numerous plants that make up the base of this food web. Things like grasses, trees, kale, berries, any vegetables you might grow. And so now that we have a handle on a food web on land, let's look at an oceanic food web. So let's start at the base again. Here we have our primary producers. They're called phytoplankton, and they are tiny algae, and they use the sun's energy to help make their own food. And next we have our primary consumers, organisms that eat those primary producers. In the ocean, they typically are small animals like krill and copepods, which are a type of zooplankton. And then you have those fish that eat the tiny animals like salmon, crabs, rockfish, or basically anything that we fish and eat ourselves. And so when you put it all together, you have the oceanic food web, and it's similar to in many ways to that on land. It's complex, it's web-like, a lot of these things eat more than one thing. However, the most striking difference between these two food webs is that in the ocean, the food web base is largely dominated by just phytoplankton. So while we're on land eating kale and avocados and lettuce and all sorts of things, the snails and the krill and the copepods are just eating phytoplankton. And now you might be thinking, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn about phytoplankton. But you should. Phytoplankton are actually quite amazing organisms, and we owe them a lot. Phytoplankton are tiny plants that live in the ocean surface, and like plants on land, they need sunlight and nutrients to grow. And aside from ultimately becoming food for all of those delicious fish we like to eat, during their food production process, phytoplankton also produce half of the oxygen in the atmosphere. So think about that. Every other breath you take comes from phytoplankton. And they also remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at a rate of 100 million tons of carbon every day. So on Earth, there are about 200 million tons of carbon in humans. And so that's half the weight of humans on Earth, every day, removed from the atmosphere by phytoplankton. And aside from their amazing abilities to keep us alive, phytoplankton are beautiful. So beautiful, in fact, that they've inspired many works of art, like this panel from an amazing work by Ernst Haeckel called Art Forms of Nature from 1904, and I just find it so beautiful. Here we have, there we go. And here we have a close-up of a dinoflagellate, which is a type of phytoplankton. Here we have a coccolithophore, another type of phytoplankton. And yet another, a diatom. And if you can see the scale bar on this photo at the very bottom, you can see that these are roughly 10 microns in diameter. And to put that in perspective, an average human hair is about 100 microns in diameter, so you could fit about 5 of these across one of your hairs. It's so tiny. But if you put them all together, and you give them enough sunlight and enough nutrients, you can see them from space. So if you see the phytoplankton or the green swirls off the coast of Washington. Now, back to your garden. In your garden, plants get their energy from the sun and get their nutrients from the soil, and they use those to combine together to make their food to grow. But in the ocean, nutrients tend to fall down in the water column, leaving phytoplankton in the sunlit surface waters to wistfully stare down at their slowly falling food in sadness. Or they would, if they had eyes. And this is the continual struggle in the ocean to bring nutrients back up to the surface water where there's sunlight for the phytoplankton to use. So what, you ask, how do these nutrients get back up to those phytoplankton? And our next hero, my personal hero, a process called coastal upwelling, which is a wind-driven process that occurs during the summer in the Pacific Northwest when wind blows southward along the coast. So in the coastal ocean, where I have the coast shown in tan and it's sloping up from the seafloor, you have warm, nutrient-depleted water at the surface and cold water near the bottom that's full of all those sinking nutrients. And when wind blows over the ocean, it pushes the surface water away, much like how wind pushes objects on land. And the wind pushes that warm, nutrient-depleted water offshore. And since it's pushing it offshore, the offshore water tends to pile up and leaving a void at the coast. But since water is a liquid and tends to fill whatever container that it is in, which I feel like a lot of us have probably experienced that, Cold, deep water is then pulled up to the surface to fill that void, righting the ocean surface and bringing those nutrients back up to the phytoplankton. And so by pushing the surface water away from the coast, the wind is able to deliver nutrients back up to the surface for all the phytoplankton to use. And this process of coastal upwelling is similar to a conveyor belt that you might experience at the grocery store, where you put food that you wish to purchase on and you brings it to the cashier. And so now you might be thinking that since some wind results in a small amount or some amount of nutrients at the surface for the phytoplankton to use, that perhaps a lot of wind would bring lots of nutrients to the surface and the phytoplankton can use those and it'll be great. But not so fast. There is such thing as too much wind. And so to understand this, let's imagine that we are in a sushi restaurant. Have any of you been to one of those sushi restaurants with a conveyor belt? Yeah, they're pretty great. Okay, so let's say you're sitting down and you're waiting, and you for something to catch your eye, and then you see it. It's your absolute favorite kind of sushi, and it's coming down the line, and you're waiting in anticipation, and you're just really hoping no one else is going to grab it. And then you realize it's taking forever, and why is it still 4 people away, and it's been full minutes since it started. The conveyor belt is moving so slowly, so excruciatingly slowly, and that you're now just sad and you're thinking about maybe leaving. And so now you're sad, but you have patience, and so you go and talk to the staff and you say, hey, can you crank that up a bit? It's really slow. And so now you talk to them, and now the plates are flying by. You're trying to grab things. You spot your favorite thing, you just miss it by a second. Goes by again because it's going so fast, just miss it again. So oh, this isn't going. There we go. It's flying by. You can't grab anything you want. And so now you're sad again. So you're still pretty patient, and so you go and talk to the staff again, and you say, hey, just turn down a little bit, it's a bit fast. And so now it's going at a great speed. You see your favorite sushi again, and you're able to grab it, and you didn't have to wait too long for it. And now you're just really happy, and you're really full, and this is probably your favorite restaurant now. These feelings of frustration and satisfaction with the sushi conveyor belt are how phytoplankton feel about wind speed. So here we have a graph showing wind speed on the bottom axis and phytoplankton productivity or phytoplankton growth on the y-axis on the side. And so at low wind speeds, phytoplankton are like you at the slow-moving conveyor belt. They can get some nutrients, but they're just taking forever to get there, and they're just waiting, and they can grow a little bit, but not great. But then, as the wind speed increases, phytoplankton are able to get more and more nutrients, and they're able to grow more and more, and they're able to use those nutrients before they speed away. And this is currently where the phytoplankton can reach their peak productivity. But then, as wind increases, the phytoplankton productivity drops again because those nutrients are just being swept away by that offshore current from coastal upwelling before the phytoplankton can use it, just like that sushi flying past you at the restaurant. And so moderate wind speeds that are close to this optimal wind speed are really the key for peak phytoplankton productivity, and also results in more delicious sushi for everyone. And so, oh, there we go. Okay. And so with your typical ideal upwelling, you have moderate winds bringing nutrients to the surface for the phytoplankton to use and providing food for all those delicious fish. However, it's not actually quite simple like that. I mean, probably many of you experience wind variability is a thing here. You don't just have constant wind all the time. You have maybe really fast winds some days and really slow winds some days, or some days they're just crazy blustery and the wind's direction switching all the time. And so what happens in that case? For example, there may be a big gust of wind that pushes water offshore, followed by weaker winds in the opposite direction. And so what happens then at the surface? Well, you would expect to see the typical upwelling and subsequent bloom of phytoplankton, but then with the wind reversal, water would be pushed back on shore and down at the coast. And if the phytoplankton are also pushed down too far at the coast, they will die because they are no longer in the sunlit waters, and so they're unable to make their food, even though they have plenty of nutrients to use. And so looking at phytoplankton from space, you can see how much variability there is in productivity off our coast. And this variability, both in time and in space, is likely a response to different wind patterns. So my research takes satellite images of ocean color, like the previous picture, and calculates how much chlorophyll, so how much of that green pigment you see at the surface, is present in the surface waters. And so in this video of chlorophyll from 2011 through 2016, the areas with the most chlorophyll are shown in red and yellow, the warmer colors, and the areas with the least are shown in the cooler colors. And if you notice, a lot of the areas with really warm colors or lots of chlorophyll are right at the coast and right in the Pacific Northwest, which is why we have such great fisheries here. And you also might notice some of the patchiness in this, and that's because of clouds. Because ocean color literally means the color of the ocean, and so satellites can't see through clouds to see what color the ocean is. And so you could sometimes have clouds, especially in the winter. And so combining satellite images like these with wind patterns, both in observations and models, we can study how phytoplankton are responding to different wind patterns and variability. And with this information, we may be able to create a phytoplankton forecast, much like a weather forecast. Such a forecast could allow us to do things like dispatch fishing boats to areas where more phytoplankton and thus more fisheries are supposed to be productive, or prepare for times when fisheries productivity is expected to be particularly low. And while we're not there yet, we're not quite at the point of fish forecasting, this kind of research will allow us to be better prepared for the future, for whatever changes might happen under climate change or just whatever happens. And so as science as our witness, we'll never go hungry again. And so thank you to my lab group at UW, the Coastal Modeling Group, my funding sources over the years, and a special thank you to Engage for this opportunity, and to Town Hall and ADAS for hosting this wonderful series.
Could you describe how climate change would affect the productivity of phytoplankton?
Yeah. So in this region, it's expected that winds will be more extreme, so higher highs and lower lows, which is actually the worst part for the phytoplankton, so they could become way less productive. However, there could be other kinds of phytoplankton that do better under those conditions, but I don't know that because I'm a physical oceanographer, not a biologist. But you could expect it to be more extreme and therefore less productivity. Yeah.
So of those, the little phytoplankton pictures you show, they remind me of bacteria. Is there some kind of relationship of the two?
They're both small, and some of them are single-cellular, but I also, I'm a physicist, and I don't actually know the answer to that. Sorry. But there are people here that probably know. There's lots of people that do biology in Engage, and I think there's some oceanographers back there that might know the answer.
Some phytoplankton are bacteria, but not all.
Excellent, thank you.
Protists, right, okay.
How does pollution affect this cycle, like water pollution around the coast, which could, I believe, be a source of nutrient for things like phytoplankton, and how would that affect your model?
So we have some sources of nutrients in the model, like with river runoff, because we have I think 19 rivers included in the model. But in terms of just runoff from land, usually that results in what we call eutrophication, where there's so many nutrients that there's a big phytoplankton bloom, but then things can't eat it fast enough, and so it all dies and sinks and creates like an oxygen dead zone, because when things die, they are broken down, and the things that break them down use all the oxygen. And so it's really actually pretty bad to have a big bloom like that.
So what's the relative mobility of the phytoplankton relative to the body of water and relative to the nutrients? I mean, do they have enough mobility so that they can stay in one place and let the nutrients go past them, or are they going to drift along with it and not get the benefit? Obviously they get it.
Yeah, so plankton is essentially Greek for wanderer, and so they're kind of pushed around by the currents, though There are some kinds of plankton that have mobility, but most of the phytoplankton that I deal with, we assume that they don't have mobility, and like the diatoms, they usually don't have any sort of mobility, and so they're just pushed around where the currents take them. And the problem with having some really strong offshore current, because even though the phytoplankton will be still with those nutrients as they're being pushed offshore, typically offshore there's more turbulence, and so phytoplankton might be mixed down out of the sunlit layer, so they can't, even if they're there, they can't produce very well.
Is it as much of a mix as a current then?
I mean, it's a current, as you move offshore, the depth of the mixed layer, as they call it, ends up being deeper than the photic zone. Although this is something that I'm actually actively researching, is whether or not that's actually true. But that's the idea.
So this your model is on the northwest.
Yes.
So can you overlay this model? There are multiple fishing grounds around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Can you overlay your model on those fishing grounds or what you're looking at so that they could be some fish forecasting for those?
Yeah, we're hoping to be able to link the phytoplankton productivity to purely physics, because that's more understood and more universal across fishing grounds. But there is some idea or thoughts that perhaps the source of so much productivity here is not just the physics, but just that we have these additional nutrient sources that have to do with the outflow from the Salish Sea, for example. And that might be more like complicated to untangle. But yeah, the ultimate goal is to do something with physics, because physics is the same everywhere for the most part, at least on Earth.
I had the exact same question.
Oh, okay. Great. Any more questions? Okay, thank you.